Hello athletes, this is Travis back with another video, hopefully to satisfy the curiosity of those out there looking to improve your training in absence of some direct coaching input. But I've put out a lot of videos on this channel trying to kind of debunk a lot of the misconceptions about heart rate training, and I think that might have misled a lot of people to think that I am against heart rate training. I'm actually very much for it, but I am always against using a tool improperly, and I think that there's a lot of bad information out there about heart rate training and oversimplification that will lead people to doing kind of the cardinal sin of coaching, which is to waste people's time with ineffective training. And so that's kind of where my focus has been with those videos, trying to prevent you guys from wasting your time. But the truth is, I actually find a great deal of value in heart rate training, and I wanted to kind of do a long overdue video actually talking about some of the ways that I use heart rate training and how I analyze that data, so that hopefully you can, those of you that do have heart rate monitors, can start to use that effectively while avoiding the mistakes that I've talked about in a lot of my other videos. And so we're bringing things inside today. I'm gonna hop on the computer, pull up some graphs, and kind of walk through those graphs and the data and how to read them. And hopefully this will help you guys with your training. But let's go ahead and cut to that now. All right, so the first graph I want to take you through is a very basic UT2 steady state and what a heart rate graph is supposed to look like. Now, I will point out that I am going to be going through heart rate data through the graph form. So this is one thing that I am a big stickler on for heart rate monitors and heart rate measurement, is that you really need a piece of equipment that will allow you to download the data and analyze it in graph form. Looking at it in real time at any given moment isn't particularly helpful unless you are extremely experienced with your own personal heart rate profiles and how that heart rate kind of moves over time. I've talked in a lot of my videos about how you can't just set given heart rate zones, and I really don't believe that you should be allowing heart rate to dictate the training paces that you are using. I think that there are too many variables that can affect heart rate while you are in any given training session. Anything as simple as your mental state. I mean, I've had a lot of times where I'll sit there and I'll be doing steady state and I'll just start to kind of imagine myself on the line at the championship and kind of getting ready and getting pumped and racing through it. And I'll look down, my heart rate's, 5 to 10 beats high because, kind of that mental adrenaline is pumping. And I guarantee you that you cannot change your training zone just with your thoughts. All right. So another reason to kind of add to the bag of why letting heart rate dictate your heart rate value at any given moment, dictate your intensity, is not a good idea. All right. But the graphs can tell a lot. It can tell a lot about how you're pacing your workout kind of in retrospect. It can tell you a lot about kind of your progress over time. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today with these graphs. All right. So what I have here is just a very basic UT2 steady state graph. All right, very well executed. And so you have the blue line there is the split. All right, and so this athlete is sitting around a 204 split for this steady state session. The black line down at the bottom is the stroke rate, so averaging about a 16 for this workout, which is a little variability here and there. And then that red line is going to be this athlete's heart rates. All right, and on the far right there, you can kind of see the where the heart rate values are. All right, so the left y-axis is the pace, and then on the right we have both the strokes per minute and the heart rate. All right, and so looking at this athlete, another reason that I like the fact that I'm using this particular athlete is this athlete's heart rate zones aren't anywhere close to what the general recommendation is going to be for a UT2 steady state. Or I say general, it's not the correct recommendation, nor is it a recommendation that I would give to anybody. But a lot of times people are going to say, do your steady state in the 130 to 150 range for heart rate. And that's absurd for most people. All right. Granted, there are some people that can do it. If I say I'm really good at guessing your favorite number, and I would give you a 20 number range, and if I got your number within that range, I'd say, well, I know how to guess, favorite numbers. That's what saying you should be in a 130 to 150 heart rate for your UT2 training is. All right. It's just random. You're going to catch some people in that net. Most of the people are going to miss. And unfortunately, a lot of the people are going to be training either too high or more likely too low in their their intensity for steady state. But you can look at this athlete here. So very quick in this workout, they are moving past even the 150. This athlete tends to kind of average in the 160s, 170s, and sometimes even and peaks out usually around 180. I think 182 for that upper end of UT2, depending on the temperature of the day. This athlete's also in California, so there's a lot of kind of heat and humidity, which also is going to have an effect on your heart rate. But the important thing that we want to look at is patterns, all right? And this is what I really want to kind of hammer in with looking at your graphs is patterns, all right? You're looking for patterns, and especially you are looking for inflection points or anomalies in that pattern, all right? Sudden changes in the rate of increase, are going to tell you a lot about how well you're pacing, all right? And now I've talked in my other videos about cardiac drift, all right? Cardiac drift is a natural elevation of your heart rate over time given consistent effort, all right? And you can see that cardiac drift in this this graph here, all right? So this athlete is at consistent stroke rate. This athlete has a consistent speed at about that 204-ish range, and their effort is consistent as well. Certainly they're going to get a little bit tired over time, but it's not a tired in the sense of like they couldn't have continued doing this pace for another 30, 40 minutes if I asked them to do so, all right? So given that consistent effort and that consistent output, the heart rate is going to elevate over time, all right? And this is where the heart rate zones, idea really breaks down, all right? Because, a lot of people that are kind of married to that heart rate zone and they believe they have to stay in that, as that cardiac drift brings them to the upper end or even out of that, that perceived heart rate zone, they're gonna start to slow down in order to accommodate for it, all right? And that's gonna be a problem. Not only the fact that you're kind of slowing out of your desired training band, but you are also usually have to slow down a lot in order to bring your heart rate, all right? Because the heart rate is very resistant to lowering while you're putting out an energy output. It's not like going a second or two slower is going to really kind of bring the heart rate down. Usually you're going to be going 5-10 seconds slower in order to get a really meaningful effect in bringing that heart rate down, because not only are you bringing your heart rate down with your effort, but you're also having to counter the natural elevation of cardiac drift, all right? And so you're really sabotaging your training in a lot of ways in that. But looking at this graph, let's go back to it. We want to look a lot at the slope, all right? The slope of this line can tell us a lot, especially over time, all right? And so, if I were to kind of pull up a little line here, all right, we got that line tool, and I'm just gonna kind of pick right in the middle of that line, and I'm gonna bring that line up to here, all right? And so that would be a consistent rate of cardiac drift, all right? And so what we're seeing though is that there's a little bit of an early rise and then it kind of settles out a little bit, all right, which is fine. And so rather we're kind of seeing a line up to about there, or even maybe here, and then another line kind of coming to here, and then another line going to there, all right? And so what each of those lines are telling us is that chances are the effort within each of those lines of cardiac drift was consistent, all right? And so there was probably 3 very subtle little shifts in effort, all right, throughout this training session for this athlete, all right? But those changes in this particular line are subtle enough, and more importantly, they're shifting down, all right? They're bringing the cardiac drift, the slope of the cardiac drift, a little bit flatter, which is okay, all right? And so we're totally all right with that. What we want to kind of guard against is inflection points in that drift and that slope line that go up, all right? Especially if we're doing some kind of aerobic or steady state session, either UT2 or UT1, we want that slope to either kind of stay consistent or kind of flatten over time, all right? And so that's the example there, all right? This is what it's telling us. And then what you could do with this is you could say, okay, well, let's say this is my graph, and I make that line. Let's go take the cardiac drift for the entirety of the workout. And you want to start that line once the heart rate settles, all right? So there's going to be a quick rise at the beginning of the workout, and then it's going to kind of settle into a consistent rise over time, all right? So pick your point once you get into that consistent rise, and then go all the way to the end. And then then you can calculate, all right, what is that drift? What is that actual slope? And so it would just be rise over run. So it's like, what is the difference in heart rate from the beginning to end of that slope, and then divide it by the number of minutes. And then you can go back to that training, let's say a month, 2 months later, and see again, measure your cardiac drift over time. And I would not do this on just a one session basis. All right, if I was kind of do this and I want to kind of measure that cardiac drift and how it was evolving over time, I would basically take an average over the course of several sessions, probably at least 5 different UT2 sessions. I would measure that slope of the line. I would try to make sure that the conditions were as consistent as possible. All right, so the temperature was as consistent as possible. My rest, how I was feeling that day, is consistent as possible. But measure that out, kind of take an average of those, at least 5 sessions, and then come back 2 months later, do the same, average out that slope over time. And a good indication that you're having a positive adaptation is that slope of the cardiac drift is going to decrease. All right, so you're never going to, or at least I've certainly never witnessed any athlete that has eliminated cardiac drift entirely. I don't know if, I don't even know if it's possible to get a zero drift line for any athletes. Maybe a guy like, Elliot Kipchoge, is going to get pretty close. I would love to see his heart rate data, for a lot of his longer runs and training sessions. It'd be very informative. But otherwise, there's going to be some slope. And I would say that it is okay to be high and to push out of what your normal, heart rate zones are in those early stages of your training. All right. So for me, for instance, 168 tends to be at the top of my UT2. I'll tend to average kind of in the 150s for a longer session. Though early in my kind of, if I've taken a long break, or maybe, for instance, right now I've been running a lot and I haven't been rowing. And when I shifted into rowing for the winter season and I step away from running, chances are my slope, my cardiac drift is going to be much steeper in those early stages because my body is not conditioned for rowing. Or certainly if I was off entirely, and 2.5 years ago when I really kind of started to get into regular training, my heart rate would shoot up very fast. All right, and so the average was usually in the kind of lower to mid 160s, and I would even kind of peak out kind of in the low 170s. But I was still at what I would consider a UT2 pace. I was just not in very good shape. And so over time, though, that slope decreased, and it would take longer and longer for me to get to that top end of what my UT2 would be. And so the other way that you can kind of use that cardiac drift in those kind of slopes is to also help you determine how much training volume is appropriate, especially if you're coming back into things and you're used to doing long sessions. A lot of times, kind of a serious athlete, serious high school or college athlete that's taking a break and come back in, they come back in with the mentality of their training at high school or college, and especially with the volume, all right? And their body's not ready for that yet, and a good way for them to kind of, ease their body appropriately back into the volume that they're used to is just to pay attention to that slope of the cardiac drift. And once that heart rate kind of is really pushing well above, I would say if you are just getting back into things, if you are doing a UT2 session, when your heart rate starts to get kind of to the higher end of what a UT1 would be, then it's probably time to stop. And I'm not saying that you are at UT1, I'm just saying that you're not conditioned, you're not in great shape, and your heart rate is just going to push out of its normal zone a lot quicker. But once it starts to get up to that point in the session, that's the amount of volume. And then if you just kind of keep repeating that and repeating that, you'll find that it'll take longer and longer and longer for your heart rate to kind of get up to that top end of your training zone. And eventually it'll get back to where it's staying within what you're used to for your UT2. And then you can use that to kind of, gauge, how well you are adapted to the volume that you're doing. All right. So a little bit more complex. That definitely requires you to kind of understand what your typical UT2 zones are. And I've also mentioned this in videos before, but with those UT2 sessions and kind of figuring out what heart rates are appropriate for your UT2, the best way is not to use any kind of formula, not to use any kind of arbitrary measurement, but to actually measure and get graphs like this heart rate data over the course of several months, and then start to kind of see based on your effort. All right, and I've talked in a lot of my videos about what UT2 steady state should feel like, and even what UT1 steady state should feel like. Go based on that, trust your feeling, do it for whatever duration you're able to maintain that feeling, and then go back and look at your heart rate and look at what what range your heart rate was in for those sessions, and then that will help you determine what is common for you for that particular training zone. All right, so for me, certainly I had many miles of steady state back when I was in my early to mid 20s, when I was training for things like the national championship and Canadian Henley, and so I was able to extrapolate that data over time. And it was very unfortunately, just like a lot of you guys, when I started to read about heart rate and I saw those graphs that were saying 130 to 150 for UT2, 150 to 170 for UT1, that induced me to start to slow down my steady state. And I had a very long period of time where I was just not getting great training as a result of that. And it took me a long time to let my instincts kind of take over what I was reading and say, this is incorrect, I need to trust what I'm doing. And also, the more I read, certainly finding Arthur Lydiard's book, Running with Lydiard, and having him kind of describe in very good detail what he called maximum aerobic steady state, what we would call UT2 effort, what it should feel like. And that helped me kind of go back and realize that I was actually doing it right before I started to kind of slow down to try to accommodate these other heart rates. All right. And it also allowed me to kind of go back in my data and see what is that heart rate should be, when I'm training in my effective training zones. And fortunately, I had enough good sense at the time not to completely buy into the 130 to 150 myth, and I brought it down to where I was maybe, trying to keep it, in the 140s at least for a little bit longer. But if I had truly, done where I was only doing all my steady state at 130, 150, I would not have accomplished what I did, with the national championships and winning Canadian Henley, because my training would have been not very effective. But that is the graph a little bit there. I do want to kind of pull up a couple other ones, so let's do that now. All right, so here we have another UT2 steady state graph. This is a little bit farther along in this athlete's kind of training kind of pattern session. You can see that we've been working on kind of getting this athlete away from just going at the same pace throughout the entire thing. I do believe you should start a little bit patient and then kind of ramp up a little bit as you go. So let's say you're used to averaging a 203 for your steady state. I would encourage you to finish your warm-up period. Your warm-up period being, as slow and patient as it needs to be, at least 10 minutes, more, up to 20, 25, maybe if you're an older athlete that's putting in a lot of volume. But I would, so going back, if you're used to averaging about 204, I'd probably finish your warm up around a 206 or so. And kind of by the time you're about midway through your volume for that day, you should be settled into that 204. And then you're maybe finishing around a 203, 202. So a little bit of ramp there. That also gives you a little bit of leeway so that if you're not having a good day, you'll find that you're not kind of accelerating and not speeding up. And you might end up averaging a 205 instead. So you might end up starting at a 206 and finishing at a 204 instead of starting at 206 finishing at a 202. So it gives you a little bit of leeway to have a day where you're just not at your best, and it doesn't affect kind of the quality of your session. All right. But looking at this, we can kind of go again and look at those slopes. And so if I kind of pull, and so let's go ahead and kind of draw a line and kind of track that cardiac drift over time. And so with this one, so this is a little bit farther in this athlete's kind of training. Far more consistent, all right? And before it kind of would flatten out over time, this one is just kind of a very consistent up, all right? And so that's telling me that even though this athlete has kind of accelerated in their splits, and we can kind of see these splits on the right side in this graph, finishing around a 159, starting around a 204, and we can see that in the squiggly blue line at the bottom of the graph representation here of that little acceleration of speed over time. But the heart rate, all right, has a very consistent slope of cardiac drift, all right? And so that is telling me is that this athlete's kind of acceleration over time is not because they are working harder, it's just because they're getting looser, their body is warm, and the speed is coming easier over time, and that's a good thing. All right, we like that. All right, and so let's go to another workout similarly where there was a kind of an acceleration of speed over time, but the slope of the cardiac drift kind of betrays the fact that this wasn't a natural increase in acceleration. Okay, so going in here, this is actually a UT1 session. I believe this was kind of one of this athlete's first UT1 sessions, and this heart rate graph really told us a lot, all right, because this athlete was kind of had in their mind that they were kind of supposed to be going a little bit faster than they should for UT1. That is very common. UT1 is meant to be just a little bit below your aerobic threshold, and a lot of people will push to and slightly past their aerobic threshold because they want to kind of get that feeling of that lactate, and it's hard to kind of get close to that without actually going over. But what we could tell with this, and unfortunately I don't have the kind of cross-reference of these splits to go along with it, but we had the kind of anecdotal data, and I was talking about this athlete through this session, but we can kind of see, and he said, basically, about, at this point here, about 40 minutes or so into it, he's feeling good and wanted to go a little bit faster. And so we have, you can track kind of the slope of the line here. So this is the slope, as it was taking us through that early stages, all right? And so you can see, this part to the left of where I started this line, that was his warm-up, all right? So that was UT2. He did a little bit of transition and then settled into UT1 for this period. So he was about, looks like about 25 minutes or so into this UT1 before he was really feeling good and wanted to kind of ramp it up a little bit, all right? And then you see that unlike the last session where the speed was getting faster but the cardiac drift was consistent, indicating that his effort was consistent, on this one there is an inflection point in that curve, all right? And so you can see that slope change at that point, all right? And he also reported that, kind of looking back, he shouldn't have gone that fast, all right? Because he was starting to push out of his aerobic zone, starting to feel a little bit of lactate and extra fatigue by the end of it. And we were able to go back and look at this heart rate graph and say, well, this is around the point where that happened, all right? Right about there. Is where that effort shifted and where he kind of went out of his aerobic training zone, all right, and started to accumulate a little bit of lactate, and that heart rate, started to respond to it and started to increase the slope. So that's kind of, a lot of different graphs here, kind of a lot of conversation, a lot of talking about this in theory as we go. I can kind of pull up, if you guys want to stick around, I'll pull up a couple anaerobic training sessions too, so we can kind of see some of the patterns there as well. All right, so with this is an anaerobic threshold session, and this is one I like to use workouts in the family of 140-20s, so that's 140 on, 20 seconds off, usually at about a 24 stroke rate. I only use those actual 140-20s for a very experienced or higher performance athlete, usually for novice athletes or masters athletes or athletes that are just getting back into adding anaerobic training to their sessions. I'll use 120-40, so 120 on, 40-second off, and then I'll evolve that over time to 130-30s. But this is in that family there. I believe this was probably 120-30 or 120-40s, and then maybe we went to 130-30s at the end. But patterns, all right? Patterns is what I want you guys to really appreciate. And you can see here that with a relatively consistent effort over the course of each of these, that the heart rate is gradually increasing, and there's not a sudden change in that slope, all right? The slope over these intervals over each of these sets is fairly consistent. And that's what we want, all right? And it's also showing us that the effort is getting harder with more volume and consistent effort, which it should. There is a little bit of acceleration here, so he might be finishing maybe a second or two faster in each of these sets than he was starting them. That's fine, but we're looking for, again, that pattern. And then taking this session and going back, we do the same workout 2-3 months later, and then you can look at the graph for that. And if the slope is flattening, or if just the absolute range of the heart rates is lowering, all right, so you're not getting to the same kind of heart rate max on each of these. And so, whatever that peak value is, that's changing for each of these, but you're still getting the same or ideally more power for it. That's a great sign of adaptation, all right? That's a good sign that your training is progressing well. And let's pull up one more anaerobic session before we kind of sign off for today. All right, and so this is 3-minute pieces, all right? So again, this is a favorite session. Now we're in transport. I like 3-minute pieces for transport sessions because they're very easy to break down, very easy to pace. You can split it 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, or 1 minute, 2 minute, 2 minute, 1 minute, or 90 second, 90 second. It's very good for training athletes to kind of set the rhythm consistently from the beginning to the end of the workout. And generally rest, I'll vary from 6 minutes to somebody who's either less fit, less experienced, or again, just getting back into anaerobic training. And then we'll progress that to either 5 minutes or 4 minutes later on. I know 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off is a very popular workout for rowing. Unless you're a very high performance athlete like D1 college, and even probably kind of higher end of D1 college or elite pre-elites, I don't think 3 minutes is enough rest period. And I actually have a video talking about why you should not be using rest period to make a workout harder. You're basically just giving yourself enough rest period so you can replicate that effort. And the more fit you are, the less stress you need to be able to replicate it. And therefore that 3 minutes might be justified. But for the most part, 4 to 6 is appropriate for the majority of athletes, and err on the longer side if you're in doubt. But let's look at this, all right? And so again, we're seeing the pattern, all right? The devil is in the pattern, all right? And so, we got a progressive increase over time of that heart rate. Usually that there's a little bit higher kind of build from the first to second session of this. The first 3 minute piece in this workout tends to be almost an extension of the warm up. And so there's gonna be a bit more acceleration on that second piece relative to the first than every piece that comes after that. But each piece should be just a touch faster, maybe half a second faster on your average split than the one before. And of course, the heart rate, if you're doing this right and pacing right, is going to elevate at a very natural and consistent pace, all right? And so if this athlete, I generally, they should not be maxing out. They should be hanging out about, 90, 95% effort at the most on this. If all of a sudden on that last session, they just kind of went ham and were trying to go for max meters, you would see inflection in that curve. That curve would suddenly spike up, all right? But that's not how we want to approach anaerobic training in the base building period, all right? We might do that a little bit more in the pre-competition, or maybe probably not even pre-competition, but deep into the competitive phase when you're actually gearing up for racing. But I don't believe you should be training to your max effort in the base building training phase, all right? That anaerobic work is really just sprinkling in, and your primary goal during that anaerobic base building phase is to accumulate volume, all right? And having one session that produces an abnormal amount of fatigue is not conducive to that long-term goal of building volume, all right? You definitely don't want a one-day session to really have a lingering effect on your ability to perform on the sessions after that, and going to max effort is going to cause that. But that's it. So I hope that really helped you guys kind of understand how I'm looking at heart rate data and how I'm using it to gauge how we're progressing in training, and kind of see if there's any kind of mistakes that we made in terms of our pacing. The kind of key thing you're looking at again is inflection points, all right? You should always be seeing steady rises in your heart rate. You don't want to see that slope bounce up, all right, or increase. If the slope starts to flatten over time, that's fine too, or that is fine. We just don't want it to kind of be, going at a nice and steady pace and then suddenly shifting up, all right? So that's gonna tell us that we messed up in our pacing at some point in that workout. But that's it. Yeah, so please share this with other people if you think it will help them. Definitely, if you're finding this for the first time, hit that subscribe button. I'll keep putting out more videos like this, and have plenty in the past that you can kind of check out. If you want to connect with me to train one-on-one, you can find me on gtsrowing.com. And other than that, good luck, guys. I hope this really helped kind of get out of that what not to do with heart rate and what you can do with heart rate. You do have to invest in a monitor that allows you to create these graphs, but fortunately that technology is a lot cheaper now than it was 15, 20 years ago when I was training. But that's it. This is Travis signing off. Thanks, guys. And if you have any questions, put it down in the comments below, and I'll be happy to answer if I can. Bye.